Now, the attack in Medina, Saudi Arabia's second most holy Muslim city, has raised growing concerns over the Islamic State's targets and overall goals. The deadly bombing killed at least 4 people, and Medina is where the Prophet Muhammad is buried.
It is considered the kingdom's most holy city after Mecca. This bloody week of attacks comes as the Muslim holy month of Ramadan ends tomorrow. New York Times Middle East correspondent Ben Hubbard is in Beirut and joins us now. Ben, why would ISIS target these cities, specifically in Saudi Arabia, including Medina, when the terror group typically goes after foreigners, Shiites, and security officers?
Well, we have to acknowledge first that one thing that's been curious about these attacks is we have not had a claim of responsibility from ISIS. So although this certainly bears the trademarks of attacks that they've carried out inside of Saudi Arabia before, it's interesting that this time they have not come out right away and said that these attacks were theirs. I mean, these 3 attacks that all hit on the same day, they hit 3 very sensitive places for the Saudi government and for the Saudi state. I mean, first hitting near the U.S. consulate in Jeddah. You know, extremists are very angry about the Saudis' close relationship with the West and specifically with the United States. Then hitting near a Shiite mosque. Saudi, because it is an officially Sunni Islamic state, has a very complicated relationship with its own Shiite population, its own Shiite minority. So there have been a number of bombings there. And then, of course, striking inside of the holy cities, which are very much at the basis of the royal family's legitimacy. I mean, the King of Saudi Arabia is not just called the King of Saudi Arabia, he's called the custodian of the 2 holy mosques. And so for ISIS to be able to say, you know, we can hit you in one of your most, in these extremely sensitive spots, sends a very strong message, even though the final death toll ended up being quite low.
You know, we've been hearing for months now that Iraqi forces and coalition forces have been chipping away at this caliphate in Syria and Iraq. And then over the past week, we see this wave of global attacks. And so I want to ask you, how would you characterize the current situation, making the assumption that ISIS is involved in these attacks? Is this an example of ISIS lashing out because it's under pressure, or a reminder that ISIS's influence goes beyond the borders of a caliphate?
Well, it's trying to defeat an organization like ISIS is a very complicated endeavor, and so I think we kind of have to break it into chunks. I think that because there's been so much coverage and because these attacks all over the world have been so dramatic and so shocking for people, we have lost track of some of the progress that has actually been made on some of the very real progress that has been made on the ground against ISIS in its homeland of Iraq and Syria. I mean, we had, you know, them losing sort of around the beginning of this year, losing the city of Ramadi in Iraq. You know, during this very Ramadan, when they carried out all these attacks abroad, they lost the city of Fallujah, which was the city that they had held in Iraq for the longest period of time. They've lost significant territory in Syria as well. So on the ground in these countries, it is losing territory. And ISIS's first way of distinguishing itself from other terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda was to say, listen, we're not just a terror group that blows things up. We're a group that owns territory. We're a group that has a real live caliphate that you can move to and you can join and become part of our project. So part of, you know, I think that as they come under pressure they're shifting their tactics towards carrying out these attacks abroad. Part of that is to show to their constituents, hey, we're still relevant, we still matter, we're still a thing. And it also, and I would say quite successfully, draws attention away from the very significant losses that they've suffered on the ground. You know, everybody pays so much attention to these attacks, but, you know, when you look at the map of what's going on in Iraq and Syria, there have been significant losses for the group in recent months.
Ben, I want to ask you, you're on the ground reporting from the Middle East. In these countries and cities where ISIS has taken hold, for example, in Raqqa, do they have the legitimate support of the people within those cities, or are those people under siege? They feel that they are being besieged by ISIS and they have no other option but to sort of kowtow to them?
Well, it's always been hard to tell because it's been very difficult for us to communicate with people inside of these cities. I think that they may have had a limited amount of support earlier on. I would be fairly surprised if most people, you know, living under ISIS, you know, who are sort of the native communities that were taken over by ISIS are big supporters of the organization now. But I think that the bigger issue here is that ISIS is an organization that thrives in failed states, and both of what we have in Iraq and Syria are, we have 2 failed states where the central government has lost its ability to convince people in these areas that it is looking out for their interests. In Syria, we have a nasty civil war going on, and most of the people that are living under ISIS areas are not probably very interested in going back under the government of Bashar al-Assad. In Iraq, we have a very complicated situation where you have a Shiite-dominated government in Baghdad that many Sunnis have deep, deep distrust for because of its policies in recent years. So the trick for really dealing with ISIS in these countries is not just a military issue, but you really have to find a way to reconstruct central government in these countries, and to have governments that can actually make the people living in these communities believe that the government belongs to them and is looking out for them. And that is a much more significant challenge, I would say, long-term than just the military battle.
All right, Ben Hubbard on the ground there in Beirut. Thank you, Ben. We appreciate it.